When you first look at the BETAFPV LiteRadio 3, it feels like it's inarguably an entry-level radio. But as you look closer at its features and consider the ways that you actually use your transmitter in day-to-day flying, you're forced to confront a question. Do you really need anything more from a radio? I'm going to guess that about half of you are either just getting into FPV or you're already open to this idea. And I bet that the other half of you just completely reject this idea outright, and you'd say, of course I need a different radio, there's no way this is enough for the type of flying I do. But no matter which camp you're in, I bet you're curious to find out where I'm going with this. So let's take a closer look at the BETAFPV LiteRadio 3. The LiteRadio 3 is a gamepad style radio, and it feels pretty comfortable to hold in the hand. The exterior is made out of a hard plastic, but the hand grips do have a nice texture to them that makes it a little bit easier to hold. The radio does live up to its name by being very lightweight. I found this radio to be much lighter than the other radios I've held and used. You'll notice that the shape of the radio is very smooth. There's not much protruding from it besides the gimbal stick ends, so there's no toggle switches, no external antenna, nothing like that. I feel like it's a nice looking design and it's not going to get caught on anything if you put it in a bag. Perhaps the most critical feature of a radio is the gimbals, and I felt like BETAFPV had some ground to make up here because the gimbals on the LiteRadio 2 weren't very good, but I was happy to see that they've made some notable improvements here. These gimbals feel pretty nice to use. I didn't notice any jitter with them or any problems like that, and I had no trouble flying with these gimbals when I was testing this radio. I can tell that these aren't as smooth as Hall gimbals and they don't offer adjustable travel or tension, but I didn't feel held back by them in flight. I also noted that they have normal M3 threaded stick ends, so if you wanted to replace the stick ends with something else, you do have the ability to do that. I definitely would have liked to have seen Hall gimbals, but I can understand why they weren't included in a radio at this price point. Fortunately, you do actually have the ability to upgrade to Hall gimbals if you want, because BETAFPV does sell that upgrade and they show you how to do it. It looks pretty easy. And you can also buy original replacement gimbals if these do ever wear out. So it was nice to see that there's a path there if you did want to improve or replace the gimbals in this radio. Moving on to the other main controls of the radio, the LiteRadio 3 forgoes the normal toggle switches that we're used to seeing on FPV controllers, and it replaces them with these rocker switches and latching buttons. If I had to guess, I'd say this will probably upset longtime pilots, but it'll be a natural control scheme for younger users. Personally, I didn't have any trouble using these controls. The rocker switches click into 3 different positions, so they're good for setting flight modes and things like that. And they do click into place fairly well, although I might have preferred to have a slightly sharper or stronger click on those switches. Should we start doing like ASMR for controllers? I don't know, something like that. The buttons press down and latch into the on position, and then they release with another press. This is probably what I was most worried about because this is typically where I would put my arm control, and you always want to be able to disarm quickly, do that panic disarm when you're about to get into trouble. And so I was worried that this was going to be slow compared to using a toggle switch like I normally would. It did take a little bit of getting used to, but honestly, I didn't have any trouble with it, and I'm pretty fast at it now, so I don't actually have any concerns about this control scheme. Looking at the front of the radio, we have a few more points of interest. There's a lanyard hole in the front if you want to use a lanyard. There's also a power button with an LED that shows you some status of the radio as you're using it. And then on the bottom of the radio, we've got a couple of pinhole buttons for bind and setup, as well as a USB-C port. This radio is an internal battery, so you're going to use that USB-C port to charge the radio, as well as to connect it to the computer for configuration and updates. An obvious omission from these features is the complete lack of a screen on this radio, and that's something that sets it apart from almost every other FPV controller. Because you don't have that screen, you're going to have to use the BETAFPV configurator on your computer to set up this radio, and you'll need to rely on the power LED for information when you're in the field. Although the BETAFPV configurator doesn't allow for the same level of customization that you'd get with OpenTX and the screen on a normal radio, it handles the basics pretty well. You can use it to configure the settings for the internal Express LRS module, and it also allows you to change the channel mapping of the radio and adjust a few other settings. Fortunately, most of the things in the configurator are things that you're not really going to be adjusting all the time, so you'll probably plug it in one time, get these things set up the way you want, and then not really need to keep using that configurator. When you're using the radio out in the field, the LED on the power button is going to flash or change color to tell you status, so that's going to let you know if you're binding the radio or if the battery's low or things like that. Since I mentioned binding, let's talk about the connectivity options on the LiteRadio 3. I think this might have been the first radio to come out that had Express LRS internally built into the radio, and it's still one of only a few controllers you can get that has internal ELRS as an option, so that's pretty cool. Now the internal module in this radio only goes to 100 milliwatts, but I think you'd be surprised how far you can go with 100 milliwatts on Express LRS, even without an external antenna. This is definitely going to be enough for any backyard or park flying, and when I was testing this radio, I didn't have any range trouble at all, even with that 100 milliwatt setting. If you do feel like 100 milliwatts isn't enough, the LiteRadio 3 actually does have an external module bay that supports nano size modules. So you could take this cover off and you could actually add an external Express LRS module like this one from BETAFPV that goes up to 500 milliwatts. The external module bay supports modules that use the CRSF protocol, so that does mean that you could also add a crossfire module if you wanted to this radio, but you probably won't be able to use a multi-protocol module or an FR-Sky module. The built-in ELRS module supports all of the basic functionality of Express LRS, although you do lose out on a few of the newer features such as the Bluetooth joystick mode and dynamic transmit power. You can set a passphrase in the BETAFPV configurator to automatically bind this radio to your Express LRS receivers, or if you prefer to bind manually, there is a pinhole bind button on the bottom of the radio, and so you can press that and bind manually as well. I did bind this radio to multiple ELRS receivers while I was doing the testing, and I didn't have any trouble binding it to any of the drones I tried. One downside to the ELRS implementation on this radio is that it requires you to use the BETAFPV configurator to update the ELRS version in the radio, and so that means that you're reliant on BETAFPV to update to newer versions of Express LRS. I would have preferred to see them use a normal ELRS module in this radio because then I'd be able to use the normal Express LRS configurator and take advantage of all of those latest updates and improvements from the ELRS project directly. This kind of forces us to rely on BETAFPV to keep updating their firmware to match the latest improvements to Express LRS, and so we do have to rely on them to continue to support this radio in the future. I would have preferred to be able to update it separately. Overall, I feel like the LiteRadio 3 is pretty well thought out and pretty well designed. I like the button layout, and the gimbals feel completely usable for normal flying. This radio makes me think that BETAFPV is really focused on giving users a simple experience that's easy to just pick up and use day to day, and I do really appreciate that. This radio is very easy to charge. You just plug it into a USB-C port. You don't have to know anything about charging batteries properly, so I think that's a good thing for newer users, and it couldn't be much easier to pick up and turn on and start flying. They even provide some nice accessories and upgrade options. You can get this nice case for the LiteRadio 3 that I was really impressed with, and like I had mentioned earlier, you can get Hall gimbals if you want to upgrade the gimbals, and you could add an external Express LRS or Crossfire module to improve the capabilities of the radio. But of course, the LiteRadio 3 does have some major limitations. The lack of a screen is going to be a complete turnoff for some of you, and it does mean that you can't do the same level of configuration that you'd be able to do on a more expensive radio. There aren't any buttons or controls for trimming, so it's probably going to be a no-go for you wing flyers out there. And because this radio doesn't support OpenTX or EdgeTX, it means that you miss out on the features that those firmwares provide, such as voice callouts for telemetry. There are a couple of things that I wish they had done differently on the LiteRadio 3. I don't really like these pinhole buttons for binding and setup, especially because you do sometimes need to do those things in the field. So for example, to change between the internal and external module, you have to hold down that bind button while you power the radio on. So you're gonna have to make sure you have something that you can use to press that button. They could have just used a normal button here. I also do wish that they had made the internal Express LRS module just a standard ELRS module so that it could be updated from the ELRS configurator instead of from the BETAFPV configurator. Maybe we'll get some of those things in the LiteRadio 4. So that brings us to the question of who should buy the LiteRadio 3. I want to talk to the experienced pilots first. Now, I had challenged you guys at the beginning of this video to think about whether you really needed any more from a radio than what you get with the LiteRadio 3, and I still think that's a fun question to consider. I know for me, I do really like the Hall gimbals, and I find myself using the screen sometimes to change a model setting or switch protocols. And if you're somebody who flies planes, then this radio just isn't going to give you what you need. But if you're somebody who flies quadcopters and most of your stuff is already on Express LRS, I think you might be able to find a use case for the LiteRadio 3. It could be a good backup radio or just something to use around the house, or maybe you want to pack it on a trip instead of lugging around your big heavy transmitter. I think there are some interesting uses there. On the other hand, if you're a new pilot or if you're just getting started with FPV, I think the LiteRadio 3 is worth a look. I think it provides a really easy getting started experience, and I kind of like that it doesn't have too many settings or controls because it forces you to focus on the flying. There are also many ELRS whoops and bind and fly drones out there now, so you'd have no trouble finding a drone that you'd be able to bind to this controller and use. You might also consider this radio if you want to start with a simulator. I know a lot of times we do recommend simulators for new pilots because it's a low-cost way to get started, it doesn't have much risk, and you can learn some flight skills before you've spent more money on the hobby. This radio would be a good choice for that. It is low cost and it's going to give you a real flying experience. You don't want to use something like a PlayStation controller with a simulator because the stick feel is going to be completely different, but a radio like this LiteRadio 3 is going to give you that normal experience, and your skills are going to translate much better to a real drone if you fly with something like this. Ultimately, the question for new pilots is going to be whether you get in with this at a low price or stretch your budget a little bit more for a higher end option. You're going to have to make that choice for yourself. But what I will say is this, the LiteRadio 3 is not going to hold you back at all from enjoying FPV or getting better at flying. And if you do ever want to upgrade in the future, then maybe this could turn into your backup radio, or maybe you could give it away to a friend to help get them into FPV. I think there are some good reasons to purchase this radio. But that's going to do it for this review, and I hope you guys enjoyed this look at the BETAFPV LiteRadio 3. I would really like to know what you guys think about this radio and what you thought about the review, so please take a moment and leave me a comment below with your thoughts. If you're interested in purchasing it, I'm going to have links down in the description below, and if you use those links to make any FPV purchase, it supports the channel, so I certainly do appreciate that. Thank you guys so much for watching the video, and I'll see you in the next one.